Hi, welcome to Art at Home. My name is Liz Ndoye. Major thanks go to the Hoboken Public Library for hosting these online virtual classes that we've been having since the COVID-19 pandemic began. My goal is to help you create art at home with materials that might be readily available wherever you are sheltering in place. In the month of July, we have been inspired by artists who work in collaboration with each other. The first lesson that we did was about Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Last week, we looked at the art of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And this week we are going to study closely the work of Josef and Annie Albers. Josef and Annie Albers were a married couple. They didn't actually collaborate with each other, but they influenced each other a great deal. They both were very passionate about art, making art, and teaching art. They met in Germany, where they both were going to school at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was very influential and important in Europe in the 1930s. It was a place where innovation took place, innovation in design and fine arts. Albers, who later became famous for his Homage to a Square series of paintings, was a colorist. He loved working with color, and he liked the science and theory of color, and he would create paintings very geometric, very simple, very intellectual. Annie Albers also studied at the Bauhaus, and she studied fabric design. It wasn't something that she opted to do originally. She thought working with fabric was kind of what she called sissy work. But the only class that she could enroll in at Bauhaus in that period of time was weaving. Well, it turned out to be fortuitous for her and for the art world as well, because she became one of the greatest textile design artists who has ever lived. She and Josef Albers really created a whole new way of looking at art. They became leaders in the modernist movement in Europe. In the 1930s, they were forced to come to the United States because the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus. Josef Albers was invited to teach at the Black Mountain School in the United States. It was a new college. Again, it was very innovative and groundbreaking in modern art. Annie Albers was invited also to teach. She became an associate professor of weaving and textile design. They stayed there for many, many years, moving in the 50s to Connecticut, where they continued working on their art. Josef with his paintings, Annie Albers with her weaving. Annie Albers, while living in Connecticut, became much more involved with design work. She won many awards for design coverings that she created for walls, and gained many commissions for doing wall hangings in large corporate buildings all over the New York metropolitan area and elsewhere in the United States. They both loved traveling tremendously. They traveled all over the world, and they particularly fell in love with Mexico, where they started collecting pre-Columbian art, and they became inveterate collectors over the years. Annie Albers in particular amassed a huge collection of pre-Columbian sculpture. She also fell in love with the fabric art that she saw in Mexico and incorporated a lot of what she saw and learned about in Mexico in her own work. We are going to now look at some of the images created by Josef and Annie Albers, and then I'm going to present to you not one, but two at-home art projects that I think you will enjoy doing. Here is the young couple in Weimar, Germany. They met in 1922 at the Bauhaus, as I mentioned. This was a new teaching institution which transformed modern design, and it had been founded 3 years earlier. It emphasized the connection between artists, architects, and craftspeople. Before enrolling as a student at the Bauhaus in 1920, Josef had been a school teacher in and near his hometown of Batra in the northwestern industrial Ruhr region of Germany. Once he was at the Bauhaus, he started to make glass assemblage from detritus he found at the Weimar town dump and from stained glass. He then made sandblasted glass constructions and designed large stained glass windows for houses and buildings. He also designed furniture, household objects, and an alphabet. In 1925, he was the first Bauhaus student to be asked to join the faculty and become a master. Anneliese Elsa Frieda Fleischman went to the Bauhaus as a young student, also in 1922. Throughout Anneliese's childhood in Berlin, she had been fascinated by the visual world, and her parents had encouraged her to study drawing and painting. When she arrived at the Bauhaus, she entered the weaving workshop because it was the only one open to her, but soon embraced the possibilities of textiles, like I mentioned. She and Josef, 11 years apart in age, met shortly after her arrival in Weimar, and they were married in Berlin in 1925. In 1925, the Bauhaus moved to the city of Dessau. The Nazis had closed down the Berlin campus. In November of 1933, Josef and Annie Albers were invited to the USA when Josef was asked to make the visual arts the center of the curriculum at the newly established Black Mountain College in North Carolina. They remained at Black Mountain until 1949. In 1950, the Albers moved to Connecticut. From 1950 to 1958, Josef Albers was chairman of the Department of Design at the Yale University School of Art. Another wonderful image of the Albers. They were deeply in love. They were in love with each other, they were in love with art, and they were committed to helping others learn about art their entire lives. At Yale, and as a guest teacher at art schools throughout North and South America and Europe, Josef Albers trained a whole new generation of art teachers. Annie Albers continued to weave, design, and write. In 1963, she began to explore printmaking and experimented with the medium in unprecedented ways, while developing further as a highly original abstract art. Her seminal text on weaving was published in 1965. The Albers were in some ways like a two-person religious sect, focusing above all on their work and happy to pursue it at a remove from the trends and shifting fashions of the art world. They had an extraordinary relationship, and while never collaborating on artwork other than their highly inventive Christmas cards and Easter eggs, fostered one another's creativity and shared their profound conviction that art was central to human existence and that morality and creativity were aligned. Following Josef's death, Annie Albers helped oversee her husband's legacy while expanding her own printmaking and textile design until her death in 1994. In 1984, Annie wrote, "To comprehend art is to confide in a constant." She and Josef lived their lives devoted to that irrefutable, uplifting constant of art. This painting is emblematic of Albers' best-known series of paintings called Homage to the Square. He painted these between 1950 and 1976. He is what we call a colorist. He was fascinated with the way colors interacted and influenced each other, and he was constantly experimenting with juxtaposing colors to see how they would change each other and how they worked together or did not. He was fascinated too by how colors could work at counter purposes of each other. He also wrote an innovative publication called Interaction of Color, in which he talked about the experimental work that he did with color in his paintings and prints. He too was a printmaker, like his wife Annie. Another example of Albers' homage to squares. In this one, you can really see the interplay of color. The colors vibrate with intensity. You can also see something very interesting going on. Some of the squares seem to even disappear, but if you look closely, you can see them emerging from the background. Look at the powerful interplay between the colors. It's quite pleasing and wonderful to look at. And he did hundreds, if not thousands, of these paintings where he just played with color. This is the final Josef Albers painting that we're going to look at tonight. This one is quite extraordinary because it's not as smooth a surface as the kinds of paintings that we're most familiar with when we think of Josef Albers. There's a wonderful textural quality to the squares in this painting, and he's definitely put on more layers of paint and allowed his brush strokes to show. Again, look at the gorgeous interplay of color. In this piece, he stayed with the red-orange family. I think it's quite beautiful. It's probably Warhol. Now we're looking at Annie Albers' work. She just was so groundbreaking in weaving at that particular period of art history. This is so finely and tightly woven, it really looks like a painting. And this kind of weaving imagery that's abstract with just lines and rectangles was unheard of up until Annie Albers started using woven materials in this way. She too was groundbreaking in her own right. But you can see the affinity between her work and Josef Albers' geometric abstractions. They both shared a love for color, texture, line, and shape. All the principles of art. So you can see the influence of the Bauhaus design training that Annie Albers had. Again, the geometric abstraction, the uniformity of the patterning, all of that came from her years of study at the Bauhaus. But again, this is a weaving, a very tightly woven piece, quite wonderful. A lot of rhythm in this piece too. A lot of movement. It almost vibrates the way Josef Albers' squares vibrated. This one is more about repetition than it is about color interaction. Wonderful piece. This is an Annie Albers print. Later in her career, she discovered printmaking and created works that were really experimental and unprecedented. She really pushed the medium of printmaking as far as it could go. I love this one. It reminds me of M.C. Escher, if you're familiar with his work, the kind of tessellation imagery. This one too vibrates and moves. It's quite a wonderful textural piece. Two projects this evening. The first that we'll work on is a painting inspired by the work of Josef Albers. We are going to create a grid on paper. I'm going to be using just a regular Sharpie, and I have a piece of flat wood. I can't seem to find any rulers in my house, so I'm going to demonstrate for you how to create lines without even using a ruler. And then we're going to paint. We're going to play around with color and create a painting, a geometric abstract painting in the style of Josef Albers. The second project that we're going to work on tonight is weaving. I'm going to demonstrate for you how you can do simple cardboard loom weaving in your own home. Just a flat piece of wood that I found in my studio. If you don't have a straight edge ruler, this will work fine. The edge of a piece of paper or cardboard, the side of a book or a magazine could work too. Going to create a grid, not exactly as Albers might have. But you could do that. If you enjoy measuring and you want to make perfect squares, go ahead. Just do it. Try to make your grid off-center and not symmetrical. Making an unbalanced composition for this project, I think, will give you a lot more exciting things to play around with. You can think Mondrian too, if you know the work of Piet Mondrian. He too was a geometric abstraction artist. Most famous for a painting called Broadway Boogie Woogie, which hangs right in our Museum of Modern Art in New York City, part of their permanent collection. You can also do this in pencil first and plan out what you're doing. I probably would have done that normally, but in the interest of time, I'm just doing it directly with marker tonight. All right, so a very simple grid pattern. newspaper for the floor. This section. This is from last week. Okie dokie. I'm not going to think too much about the colors that I want to use, although those of you who remember back to the class where I talked about the color wheel, I will try and play around with complementary colors and see what happens. So complements would be red with green, yellow with violet, and orange with blue. I invite you, of course, to go back and watch those sessions if you don't recall, or you can look online for color theory. Just type in the search engine color theory and you'll find lots of information about color mixing and the concept of complementary colors. I might, though, since I started with red in the middle, I might go for red family colors tonight. I created the grid first with marker, and now I'm just having fun filling in and painting. I'm using acrylic paint. Easy to obtain online, or if you're thinking it's safe enough to go to the local Michaels, you can get any brand acrylic paint that you might need. Also Dick Blick you can order online. This is a very satisfying project if you like maintaining control in your work. This one is a relatively controlled project. If you are more like me, if you are a messy painter, you could enjoy your own personal style as well. Remember the final Albers piece that we looked at, he was more relaxed in that work, allowing the brush strokes to show, not very worried about keeping his edges pristine and neat. So this is a project where you can let your own personal style shine through. of salmon color here, or peach. I am having fun mixing. So I created the peach by mixing red with yellow, and then I added white for the final color. A little bit of violet. Not too much blue though. I want to stay with warmer colors tonight. Oops, I just added a lot of blue. That's okay, let's use it. I am actually covering over the marker that I used to create the grid. That's perfectly fine, but if that is troublesome for you, I would use a smaller brush, probably one with a round pointy tip, and you'll be able to control the paint easily. This is a project you can do multiple times too. Just keep creating new grids and have fun. My favorite tip about painting to give is do your mixing on your palette first. Don't try and mix on the painting itself, because if you make mistakes, it's going to be incredibly difficult to fix them. Always best to mix first on the palette, see if you like the color. Change it first on the palette. So this is fairly monochromatic at this point. I'm staying in the red family of colors. But in a moment, I'm going to change that, and I hope it looks good. For me, the most thrilling thing about art is just doing it and experimenting and seeing what happens. And with geometric abstraction, you have a lot of opportunity to do that. I like this very pale peach. All right, now here's the unexpected. The unexpected is that I've added green. Green and red are complementary colors. And I believe it's added a bit more interest and excitement to this piece. All right, well, there's way more work I could do on this painting. There's always more one can do. But I think I've shown you enough to give you a sense of what you can accomplish. Now we're going to move on to weaving, inspired by Josef Albers' wife and wonderful artist in her own right, Annie Albers. Weaving is done on a loom. You can look around your home for any old piece of cardboard. This is just an old cardboard box that I cut up. What I did then, after I made the rectangular piece, I cut notches. They're about 1 to 1/2 inch apart. And I cut notches on the bottom and the top. The next thing you do is warp up the loom. You want to use a thread that's pretty strong, one that when you yank on it, it won't break. The warp is the whole base of your weave. The warp thread gets attached to the notches, top and bottom, and you start by tying the warp thread to the first top notch. And you basically wrap the warp thread from the top to the bottom notch all the way around the back of the loom until you get to the end of your loom. Oops, I didn't cut enough warp thread. That's not a problem. You just cut more string. Tie it on and keep going. You can use a thick warp thread or thin. The thick warp thread will create an interesting texture to your weaving when you're done. The thin warp thread won't even be visible when you're finished. So the more weaving you do, the more knowledgeable you'll become about what kind of warp thread you like using. I'm using now a more traditional warp thread. So I'm at the end of my loom, and I'm going to tie another knot to secure it in place. This part's pretty important. The warp threads create the vertical base across which you will weave. So the completed warping looks like this. Now I'm choosing the yarn that I'm going to use to actually weave with. This will be the first thread that I make go horizontally across the loom. I'm going to tie it onto the first warp thread. Again, I'm going to double knot it to make sure it's secure. Trim the end so it doesn't get in the way. And voila, we are ready to weave. I like to wrap the extra length into a ball. Just makes it a little faster and easier for me. The first thread is over the warp thread. That means the next thread goes under. Remember, weaving is a process of making a piece of fabric, basically, and the way you do it is by going under, over, under, over, under. When you get to the end of your row on the loom, you repeat the process going back in the other direction. We ended this row under, so the next row is going to go over the warp thread. First, over, under, over, under, over, under. I even say the word silently to myself as I go. You want to keep pushing the horizontal weaving close together and keep going. You keep going till you come to the bottom of your loom, continuing the over-under pattern. You will get faster at it. You can even create what's called a shuttle. You can get a strip of cardboard and put it through the warp threads, over, under, and then you can just shoot your thread across. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you that tonight. The one last thing I do want to make you aware of, you don't have to stay with the same color. Have fun changing the color yarns that you use, the thickness of the yarn. You can cut and then tie something different and just keep going. So I ended the orange under. That means the next row becomes over. Under, over, under, over, under. Till you go all the way across to the other side. Push your threads close together and keep going. I ended this row under, so again, the next row starts over. Over, under, and so on. And you can see that a piece of fabric is starting to emerge. Again, this row ended under. Under, so I go over the first warp, under, over, under, over, under. And you keep going till you get to the bottom of your loom. You tie your end. You then cut the threads on the back, and you tie each warp thread to the one next to it. We don't have time to complete the process this evening. I will be teaching a weaving class once we get back to the Hoboken Public Library when the shelter-in-place rules are over. But for now, I want to again thank the Hoboken live. So we did a lot tonight. We did geometric abstraction, we played around with color, we learned some of the basics of weaving, and now I want to say thank you so much to the Hoboken Library. It's so fantastic that we have this opportunity to experiment with art at home. If you want to see this lesson or any other lesson that we've done over the months where we've been doing art at home, please visit the HobokenLibrary.org website to find out more. Good night, art on, and I hope you enjoy these projects. Bye-bye.